The furious Chinese billionaire was storming out of the building after a failed meeting, until the janitor's 7-year-old daughter, speaking perfect Mandarin, made him freeze in complete shock. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. David Chen's Italian leather shoes clicked angrily against the marble floor as he stormed through the downtown Chicago office building's lobby. His jaw was clenched so tight it hurt, and his dark eyes blazed with the kind of fury that came from watching 3 hours of his life disappear into corporate incompetence. "Absolute disaster," he muttered under his breath, his accent thick with frustration. The biggest real estate deal of his career, a $2 billion development project, had just crumbled because nobody in that boardroom could understand a single word he'd said to the other Chinese investors. At 35, David had built an empire that stretched from Shanghai to San Francisco. He was worth more money than some small countries, but right now he felt completely powerless. All because of a language barrier and a room full of people too proud to admit they needed help. He jabbed the elevator button repeatedly, his expensive watch catching the afternoon light. The building felt suffocating. Every second here reminded him of his failure, of the investors who'd walked away, shaking their heads, of the opportunity that had slipped through his fingers like water. "Excuse me, mister." The tiny voice came from somewhere near his elbow. David looked down, irritation flashing across his features. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, stood beside him wearing a faded yellow dress and clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Her dark hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, and her brown eyes held a wisdom that seemed far too old for her face. "I'm busy," David snapped, turning back to the elevator. "You look very sad," the child said softly in fluent Chinese, though her words came out as perfect English to anyone listening. David froze. His finger, poised to press the elevator button again, stopped mid-air. He turned slowly, staring down at the little girl with wide eyes. She had just spoken to him in perfect Chinese, her pronunciation flawless, her tone gentle and caring. "What did you say?" he whispered, switching to English, his voice filled with amazement. The girl smiled, a gap showing where her front tooth should be. "I said you look sad," she replied, now speaking English. "My name is Emma Rodriguez. What's yours?" David's heart was pounding. In 20 years of living in America, he'd never heard a non-Chinese child speak his native language so beautifully. Her accent was better than most of his American business partners who'd studied Chinese for years. "How do you—" he began, then caught himself. "Where did you learn to speak Chinese?" Emma's face lit up. "From cartoons," she said, continuing in Chinese, but David could hardly believe what he was hearing. "I watch them every day after school. Chinese Peppa Pig, Dragon Tales in Chinese. My daddy works here, and sometimes the people who visit speak Chinese and can't talk to the English speakers. So I thought maybe if I learned, I could help them understand each other." Something inside David's chest loosened, just a fraction. This child, this impossibly small, impossibly wise child, had learned Chinese fluently just to help people communicate. Meanwhile, he'd spent the afternoon watching grown men destroy million-dollar deals because they couldn't be bothered to try. "Your father works here?" David asked, responding in Chinese, amazed at how naturally the conversation flowed. Emma nodded enthusiastically, her Chinese as smooth as any native speaker. "He's the janitor on the 15th floor. He's really good at his job, but—" Her smile faltered slightly. "Some people think he should know more English. He tries so hard, but it's difficult for him." The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. David stepped back, suddenly in no hurry to leave. Something about this little girl had shifted the entire atmosphere of his disastrous day, and he wasn't ready to let that feeling go. But as Emma waved goodbye and skipped toward the building's back hallway where the maintenance offices were located, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. A official-looking woman in a business suit was following Emma, clipboard in hand, wearing the kind of expression that meant someone was about to lose their job. The elevator doors had barely closed when David found himself pressing the button for the 15th floor instead of the parking garage. Something about Emma's worried expression when she mentioned her father had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. He'd built his fortune on instinct, on reading people and situations others missed. And right now, every instinct told him this little girl was in trouble. The 15th floor was corporate offices, gleaming conference rooms and mahogany desks. But David followed the sound of a vacuum cleaner down a side hallway, past doors marked maintenance and storage. He found Miguel Rodriguez in a supply closet, methodically organizing cleaning supplies with the kind of precision that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. Miguel was probably in his 40s, with calloused hands and tired eyes, but when he looked up and saw David's expensive suit, his expression immediately shifted to cautious respect. "Can I help you, sir?" Miguel asked in heavily accented English. David studied the man's face and saw Emma's gentle eyes, the same quiet dignity. On the shelf behind Miguel sat a worn Spanish-English dictionary, its pages dog-eared from constant use. "Your daughter," David said carefully. "She speaks Chinese." Miguel's face lit up with pure pride, the exhaustion melting away. "Emma, yes, she is. How do you say, very smart girl. She watched Chinese cartoons, learned by herself. She tell me maybe someday she help people understand each other better." His smile faltered. "But my English not so good. People here, they say I should know more, should understand better when they talk fast." "How long have you worked here?" David asked. 5 years. I clean good, I work hard, I never miss day." Miguel's voice carried a quiet desperation. "But new manager, she say building need people who speak perfect English for when important visitors come. She say I make building look." He struggled for the word, unprofessional. David felt that familiar anger rising again, but this time it wasn't directed at incompetent executives. This was something deeper, more personal. Here was a man who worked twice as hard as anyone in those boardrooms upstairs, whose daughter had taught herself an entire language out of love and hope, and some bureaucrat wanted to throw it all away because of an accent. "When?" David asked quietly. "Tomorrow. They tell me tomorrow." Miguel's voice cracked slightly. "Emma, she don't know yet. I don't know how to tell her we have to move, maybe go back to my brother in Arizona, start over again." David was already reaching for his phone when footsteps echoed in the hallway. The woman in the business suit from downstairs appeared in the doorway, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said crisply, "I need you to sign these termination papers, and you," she turned to David with barely concealed annoyance, "shouldn't be in employee areas." But what she didn't know was that David Chen hadn't become a billionaire by backing down from fights that mattered. "Actually," David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had intimidated CEOs across 3 continents, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The woman, her badge read Janet Morrison, Human Resources Director, blinked in surprise. She clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who had just emerged from a maintenance closet. "I'm sorry, but this is a private personnel matter," Janet said, her voice sharp. "Security will escort you out, if necessary." David pulled out his business card, the simple white rectangle that had opened doors from Manhattan to Shanghai. "David Chen, Chen International Development. I believe your company has been trying to secure Asian investors for the Morrison Tower project." Janet's face went white. The Morrison Tower, her family's legacy project, had been stalled for months because they couldn't find investors willing to commit to the billion-dollar downtown redevelopment. And David Chen wasn't just any investor. He was the investor every developer in Chicago wanted to meet. "Mr. Chen," she stammered, "I had no idea you were in the building. If you'd like to schedule a proper meeting—" "I'm here for Mr. Rodriguez," David said simply, "and I'm curious about your hiring practices." Miguel looked between them, confusion clear on his weathered face. He didn't understand the power dynamics shifting around him, but he recognized the change in Janet's demeanor. "Mr. Rodriguez is being terminated for communication deficiencies," Janet said carefully, as if walking through a minefield. "It's a business decision. Show me his performance reviews," David said. "I don't think—" "Show me." The temperature in the small space seemed to drop 10 degrees. Janet reluctantly flipped through her clipboard. "Well, his work quality is rated excellent, punctuality excellent, reliability excellent, but his English comprehension scores are irrelevant if he's never missed a day, and his work is excellent," David interrupted. "Tell me, Ms. Morrison, how many of your executives speak Spanish?" "That's not the same thing, isn't it?" David stepped closer, and Janet instinctively stepped back. "You're firing the most reliable employee you have because he struggles with a second language. While upstairs, your executives just lost a $2 billion deal because none of them bothered to learn Chinese." Miguel's eyes widened. He was beginning to understand that this stranger in the expensive suit was fighting for him, though he couldn't fathom why. "Mr. Chen," Janet said, her voice strained, "surely we can discuss this rationally." "We can," David agreed. "Here's my rational proposal. Mr. Rodriguez keeps his job, gets enrolled in English classes that the company pays for, and his daughter Emma gets hired as a part-time translator for your international meetings." "A 7-year-old? That's absurd." "That 7-year-old speaks better Chinese than anyone in your boardroom. I know because I just came from there." David's smile was razor-sharp. "And unless you want Chen International to walk away from the Morrison Tower deal permanently, I suggest you start seeing absurd as innovative." Janet's hands were trembling slightly on her clipboard. The Morrison Tower project was her family's last chance to restore their reputation in Chicago real estate. Without it, they'd lose everything. But what none of them noticed was Emma herself standing quietly in the hallway, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest, listening to every word with eyes far too old for her young face. Emma stepped into the supply closet, and the tension that had been building between the adults immediately shifted. Miguel's face crumpled with a mixture of relief and shame when he saw his daughter. "Papa," she said softly in Spanish, then switched to English for the others' benefit. "I heard what happened." David watched as this tiny girl positioned herself between her father and Janet Morrison, her chin raised with quiet determination. There was something almost regal about the way she carried herself, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her entire short life. "Emma," Miguel began, but she held up her small hand. "Mr. Chen," Emma said, turning to David with remarkable composure, "thank you for trying to help my father, but I don't think Mrs. Morrison wants our help." Janet flushed red. Being lectured by a child was bad enough, but being lectured by a child who was clearly more articulate than most adults was mortifying. "This is a business decision," Janet repeated weakly. Emma tilted her head, studying Janet with the kind of direct gaze that made adults uncomfortable. "My father cleans 20 floors every night. He fixes things that are broken. He never complains, even when people are rude to him. He learned English well enough to do his job perfectly for 5 years. She paused, her voice taking on a gentleness that somehow made her words more powerful. What business decision makes sense about firing someone like that? David felt something shift in his chest. This child wasn't just intelligent, she possessed the kind of wisdom that came from watching the world carefully, from understanding pain and injustice at an age when most kids were worried about playground politics. Furthermore, Emma continued, her Chinese now flowing as naturally as breathing. I've been watching the international meetings in this building for months. The confusion, the missed opportunities, the frustration when people can't communicate. I could help with that. Janet stared at Emma in shock. The child had just delivered a business proposal in fluent Chinese, then seamlessly switched back to English to ensure everyone understood. You're 7 years old, Janet said faintly. Yes, Emma agreed. And I speak 3 languages fluently. How many languages do you speak, Mrs. Morrison? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Janet's face was now approaching the color of a ripe tomato. David had to suppress a smile. Emma Rodriguez was going to be a force of nature someday, assuming the world didn't crush her spirit first. But as he watched Miguel's proud, worried expression, he realized the stakes were higher than just one man's job. This was about whether kindness and hard work mattered in a world that seemed to value everything else more. This was about whether a little girl's faith in the goodness of people would be rewarded or shattered. Ms. Morrison, David said quietly, I'm going to make you an offer you really can't refuse. But before he could continue, his phone buzzed with an urgent message that made his blood run cold. The other Chinese investors from the failed meeting were threatening to pull out of not just this deal, but 3 other projects worth over $5 billion. And they'd only reconsider if David could prove that American companies were worth their trust. David stared at his phone, the words blurring together as the full weight of the situation hit him. $5 billion hanging in the balance. His reputation, built over 2 decades of careful negotiations and flawless execution, suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. Bad news, Emma asked quietly, her 7-year-old intuition picking up on his distress faster than most adults would have. David looked down at her, this remarkable child who had somehow become the center of his most important business crisis and made a decision that went against every corporate instinct he'd developed. Emma, he said, how would you like to help me save several very important business deals? Janet Morrison's eyes nearly popped out of her head. Mr. Chen, surely you're not serious about involving a child in what? In solving a communication problem that your entire executive team couldn't handle. David's voice carried a dangerous edge. In demonstrating that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. Miguel stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding his confusion about the business implications. Sir, Emma is good girl, but she is still child. I cannot let her. Papa? Emma interrupted gently. What if this could help us stay here? What if this could help you keep your job and show everyone how smart and hard-working you are? The hope in Miguel's eyes was painful to watch. Here was a man who had worked his entire life to build something stable for his daughter, only to have it threatened by people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. David's phone buzzed again. Another message from the Chinese investors, this one more pointed. American business culture appears incompatible with our values, reconsidering all partnerships. Emma, David said carefully, the businessmen I was meeting with today are very upset. They feel like American companies don't respect them or understand their culture. If they leave, a lot of people will lose their jobs, not just your father. Emma's expression grew serious, her young face taking on the weight of adult concerns. What do they need to hear? That we can build bridges between our cultures. That communication is possible when people try hard enough. David paused, studying her face. That someone like you exists, someone who learned Chinese not for money or business, but because you wanted to help people understand each other. Could I talk to them? Emma asked simply. Janet Morrison made a strangled sound of protest, but David held up his hand. Emma, these are very important, very serious business meetings. The men I'm talking about control billions of dollars. They're not used to He struggled for the right words. "They're not used to children," Emma finished for him. "But maybe that's exactly why they need to meet me. Maybe they need to remember that learning languages and building bridges isn't about business at all. It's about caring enough to try." David felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. The Chinese investors weren't just angry about the failed communication. They were frustrated by what they saw as American arrogance, the assumption that everyone should adapt to American ways instead of finding middle ground. But what if he could show them something different? What if he could demonstrate that American culture could produce something as beautiful as this child's selfless desire to help others communicate? "Mr. Chen," Janet said desperately, "this is highly irregular." "So was firing your best employee for having an accent," David replied. "Emma, if I arranged for you to meet these businessmen tomorrow, would you be willing to tell them your story? In Chinese?" Emma's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only children could muster for new adventures. But there was something else there too, a deep understanding of the responsibility she was taking on. "I'll do it," she said solemnly, "but I have one condition." David raised an eyebrow. This 7-year-old was negotiating with him. "My father comes with me, and Mrs. Morrison has to promise in front of everyone that he gets to keep his job no matter what happens in the meeting." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic 15 floors below. David found himself in the unusual position of being outmaneuvered by a second grader. Emma's condition wasn't just smart, it was brilliant. By insisting that Miguel be present and that Janet make public promises, she was creating accountability that went far beyond a simple business deal. "That's actually quite sophisticated thinking," David admitted. Emma shrugged, a gesture that seemed far too mature for her small frame. "My father taught me that promises mean more when other people hear them, and that family should always stick together, especially when things get scary." Miguel's eyes filled with tears. Here was his daughter, barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, protecting him with a wisdom that humbled everyone in the room. Janet Morrison looked like she was trapped in a nightmare where 7-year-olds had somehow taken over the business world. "This is insane," she muttered. "Is it?" David asked. "Your family's entire legacy depends on the Morrison Tower project. The Chinese investors are ready to walk away from that and 4 other major developments. Emma is offering to help fix a problem that your entire company couldn't solve." He paused, letting the weight of the situation settle. "Seems like the sanest thing anyone's proposed all day." "But why?" Janet asked, her voice smaller now. "Why would you care about Miguel's job? Why would any of this matter to someone like you?" David was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma's expectant face. The question deserved an honest answer, but the truth was more personal than he usually shared in business situations. 20 years ago, he said slowly, "I came to America with nothing but ambition and a suitcase full of dreams. I spoke broken English, I didn't understand the culture, and I made mistakes every single day." He looked at Miguel. "I know what it feels like to work twice as hard as everyone else just to prove you belong somewhere." Emma's eyes widened with understanding. "Someone helped you when you needed it." "A janitor, actually," David said with a small smile. "An old Irish man named Patrick who worked in the first office building where I had a job. I was struggling with English, making mistakes in meetings, and my boss was getting frustrated with me." The memory was surprisingly clear after all these years. "Patrick started staying after his shift to help me practice pronunciation. He'd bring English newspapers, and we'd read them together. Never asked for anything in return." "What happened to him?" Emma asked softly. "He died of a heart attack about 5 years later. I was already successful by then, but I never got the chance to really thank him. Never got to show him how much his kindness mattered." David's voice caught slightly. "When I saw you today, Emma, speaking Chinese just because you wanted to help people communicate. It reminded me of Patrick, of how much difference one person's kindness can make. The supply closet had gone completely silent. Even Janet Morrison seemed affected by the story, her clipboard forgotten at her side. "So you see," David continued, "this isn't just about business deals or building projects. This is about whether we're the kind of people who help each other or the kind who look for reasons to tear each other down." Emma stepped forward and without hesitation took David's hand in her small one. "Patrick would be proud of who you became," she said simply. David felt something break open in his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart during decades of ruthless business negotiations. This child saw straight through to the lonely immigrant he'd once been, to the part of him that still remembered what it felt like to be dismissed and underestimated. "Emma," he said gently, "I need to ask you something important. Learning Chinese from cartoons is impressive, but tomorrow's meeting will be very formal, very serious. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of pressure?" Emma's smile was mysterious in a way that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Mr. Chen," she said, "there's something about my Chinese lessons that I haven't told anyone yet, something that might surprise even you." And with that cryptic statement, she turned toward the door, leaving 3 adults staring after her in bewildered silence, wondering what other secrets this extraordinary child might be hiding. That evening, David found himself in the most unlikely place he'd been in years, sitting at a small formica table in Miguel and Emma's modest apartment, sharing tamales that tasted better than any meal he'd had in a 5-star restaurant. The apartment was tiny but immaculate, filled with Emma's artwork, taped to the refrigerator, and Miguel's carefully tended plants on every windowsill. It was the kind of home that spoke of love, making up for what money couldn't provide. "So," David said, watching Emma carefully organize her Chinese workbooks on the coffee table, "what's this surprise you mentioned?" Emma glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly, despite not understanding the conversation that was happening in Chinese. "I didn't just learn Chinese from cartoons," Emma said, her voice taking on a gravity that seemed impossible from someone so small. "My teacher at school noticed I was picking up languages really quickly. She arranged for me to have video calls with a Chinese university professor twice a week for the past year." David nearly choked on his water. "A university professor, Professor Li Wei, at Beijing University. She specializes in business Chinese and cultural communication." Emma pulled out a tablet that looked far too sophisticated for a 7-year-old. "She's been teaching me formal business language, proper etiquette for meetings, and the cultural nuances that most Americans miss when they're trying to work with Chinese companies." David stared at the screen as Emma showed him video call logs, homework assignments written in complex Chinese characters, and certification documents that would have impressed graduate students. "Emma," David said slowly, "you're not just fluent in Chinese. You're formally trained in international business communication. And Professor Lee says I have a gift for understanding how different cultures think about respect and relationships in business settings." Emma's cheeks flushed pink with pride. "She says most failed international deals happen because people focus on money instead of trust." Miguel watched his daughter with obvious pride, even though he couldn't follow the technical details of what she was explaining. But David was beginning to understand that Emma wasn't just a remarkable child. She was possibly the most qualified person in Chicago to facilitate Chinese-American business relations. "Why didn't you mention this before?" David asked. Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "Because people already think I'm weird for learning Chinese. If they knew I was studying business culture too, they'd probably think I was some kind of, what's the word, freak." "Emma," David said gently, "what you've accomplished is extraordinary." Tomorrow isn't just about saving my deals or your father's job. You could actually help change how international business gets done in this city. But what if I mess up? Emma asked. And for the first time, David heard the uncertainty of a scared little girl beneath all that remarkable competence. What if the investors think I'm just a silly American kid playing dress-up? Miguel didn't need to understand Chinese to recognize his daughter's moment of doubt. He moved to sit beside her, wrapping his work-worn hands around her small ones. "Mija," he said softly in Spanish, "you have spent your whole life building bridges between people. Tomorrow, you just build one more bridge. But remember, you're not responsible for whether people choose to cross it." Emma translated for David, and he felt his respect for Miguel deepen even further. This man, who struggled with English but understood human nature perfectly, had just given his daughter the most important business advice David had ever heard. "Your father is right," David said. "Emma, I've been in business for 20 years, and I've never met anyone, adult or child, who understands what you understand about bringing people together." Emma's smile was radiant, but David could see the weight of responsibility settling on her young shoulders. Tomorrow would either prove that kindness and cultural understanding could triumph over prejudice and corporate politics, or it would crush the spirit of the most remarkable child he'd ever met. Neither of them noticed Miguel quietly making a phone call in the kitchen, speaking rapid Spanish to someone who seemed very interested in what would happen at tomorrow's meeting. The Morrison Tower conference room had been transformed overnight. Janet Morrison had spared no expense: fresh flowers, premium catering, and a view of Lake Michigan that had impressed dignitaries from around the world. But David could see the desperation beneath the luxury. Emma sat between David and Miguel, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her look both professional and childlike at the same time. She'd braided her hair carefully and clutched a small notebook filled with Chinese characters in her precise handwriting. "They'll be here any minute," Janet whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the water glasses for the third time. "Mr. Chen, are you absolutely certain about this?" Before David could answer, the conference room doors opened and 3 men in immaculate suits entered. David recognized them immediately: Li Jiao, Chen Wei, and Wang Ming, some of the most powerful investors in Asia. Their combined net worth exceeded that of some small countries. "Gentlemen," David said, rising and switching to formal Chinese, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Li Jiao, the eldest and most traditional of the 3, nodded curtly. His eyes swept the room and stopped abruptly when they landed on Emma. The confusion on his face was unmistakable. "Mr. Chen," Li Jiao said in heavily accented English, clearly making an effort to include the others present. "We agreed to this meeting out of respect for our long relationship, but I must ask, why is there a child present at a business discussion?" David felt Emma tense beside him. This was the moment that would determine everything. "Mr. Li," David said carefully, "I'd like you to meet Emma Rodriguez. She has something to say that I believe will change your perspective on American business culture." Li Jiao's expression remained skeptical, but his natural politeness prevented him from being overtly dismissive. "Very well." Emma stood up, her small frame dwarfed by the massive conference table, but her voice was steady and clear as she began speaking in flawless Chinese. "Honorable gentlemen," she said, using the most formal address patterns, "my name is Emma Rodriguez. I am 7 years old, and I learned Chinese because I wanted to help people understand each other better." The 3 investors exchanged glances of surprise. Emma's pronunciation was perfect, her tone appropriately respectful, and her word choice showed sophisticated understanding of business formality. "I know you are frustrated with American companies," Emma continued, her Chinese flowing like poetry. "You feel that we do not respect your culture or understand the importance of relationships in business. You are right to feel this way. Li Zhao leaned forward, clearly intrigued despite himself. But I want to tell you about my father, Emma said, gesturing to Miguel, who sat proudly despite not understanding the words. He is a janitor in this building. He works harder than anyone I know, but some people want to fire him because his English is not perfect. They judge him without seeing his heart or his dedication. Chen Wei, the youngest of the investors, was watching Emma with growing fascination. You gentlemen are being judged the same way, Emma said with startling directness. People see your accents, your different business customs, and they assume you are difficult to work with. They do not take time to understand that your way of doing business, building trust first, respecting relationships, is actually better than the American way of rushing to sign contracts. The room had gone completely silent. David realized that Emma wasn't just translating or facilitating, she was delivering a cultural critique that cut straight to the heart of why international business so often failed. Mr. Chen brought me here, not because I am clever for a child, Emma continued, but because I represent something he hopes America can become. A place where people learn about each other not for profit, but because understanding each other makes us all better. Li Zhao set down his pen and fixed Emma with an intense stare. Child, he said in Chinese, those are beautiful words. But words are easy. How do we know this is more than performance? Emma's response would determine whether $5 billion in development projects lived or died. But what she said next shocked everyone in the room, including David. Mr. Li, Emma said, her 7-year-old voice carrying a weight that seemed impossible, you want to know if this is performance? Then let me tell you something I have never told anyone, not even my father. David felt his heart rate spike. Emma was going off script, venturing into territory they hadn't discussed. When I started learning Chinese, it wasn't just because I wanted to help people communicate. It was because I was tired of watching my father come home sad every day, tired of seeing him practice English words in the mirror, trying to get rid of his accent so people would respect him. Miguel's face crumpled as Emma translated her words into Spanish for his benefit. He had never known that his daughter had witnessed his private struggles. I thought that if I could learn Chinese perfectly, maybe I could show people that learning languages is about love, not just business. Maybe I could prove that someone with an accent, like my father, like Mr. Chen, like all of you, can be the smartest person in the room. Li Zhao's stern expression was beginning to soften. But what I learned, Emma continued, is that the problem isn't language at all. The problem is that people are afraid of what they don't understand. And instead of admitting they're afraid, they decide that different is wrong. She turned to Janet Morrison, who had been sitting in stunned silence. Mrs. Morrison, you wanted to fire my father because you were afraid that important visitors would think less of your company if they heard his accent. You were afraid that being different meant being inferior. Janet's face was flushed, but she didn't argue. Emma turned back to the Chinese investors. And you gentlemen are afraid that American companies will never respect your culture enough to build real partnerships. You're afraid that we see you as sources of money instead of as people with wisdom and values. Chen Wei leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. This child, he said in Chinese, understands more about international business than most of the consultants we've hired. But fear, Emma said, her voice growing stronger, is just love that doesn't know where to go. My father's fear comes from loving me enough to want to provide for me. Your fear comes from loving your culture enough to want it respected. Mrs. Morrison's fear comes from loving her family's legacy enough to want to protect it. The room was so quiet that the only sound was the distant hum of Chicago traffic 15 floors below. So instead of being afraid of each other, Emma said, what if we love each other? What if we build businesses the way my father cleans this building, with care, with pride, with attention to every detail because it matters to people we care about? Li Zhao stood up slowly and walked around the conference table to where Emma sat. For a moment, David was terrified that the older man was going to scold the child for her presumption. Instead, Li Zhao bowed formally to Emma, the same bow he would give to a respected business partner. "Young lady," he said in Chinese, "you have taught me something today. You have reminded me why I went into business in the first place, not for money, but to build something meaningful." He turned to David. "Mr. Chen, we are prepared to move forward with all 5 development projects, but we have conditions." David held his breath. "Emma Rodriguez must be our official cultural liaison for all Chinese partnerships. And Miguel Rodriguez must be promoted to head of facilities management for the Morrison Tower project." Janet Morrison nearly fell out of her chair, but Li Zhao wasn't finished. "Furthermore, we want to establish a scholarship program for children like Emma, children who understand that learning about other cultures is an act of love, not just business strategy." Emma's eyes filled with tears of joy, but before anyone could celebrate, David's phone buzzed with an urgent message that made his blood run cold. Someone had been recording their meeting, and the video was already going viral. David stared at his phone in horror as the video clip spread across social media platforms faster than he could track. Someone had live-streamed Emma's speech, and now millions of people were watching a 7-year-old girl deliver the most profound critique of corporate culture that the internet had ever seen. 50,000 shares in the first 10 minutes, David muttered, refreshing the screen obsessively. 100,000, 200,000. "Is that good or bad?" Emma asked, though her face suggested she already knew the answer. Li Zhao was also checking his phone, his expression grave. "My colleagues in Beijing are calling. This video has reached China already. People are asking if this is real or some kind of publicity stunt." The conference room had transformed from a space of triumph to one of crisis management. Janet Morrison looked like she was having a panic attack. Miguel was trying to understand why everyone had suddenly become so tense, and the other Chinese investors were fielding rapid-fire phone calls in Mandarin. "How did this happen?" David demanded. "Who was recording?" Janet's face went pale. "The building has security cameras in all conference rooms. They're supposed to be for insurance purposes only, but—" She trailed off, looking sick. "But what?" David's voice was dangerously quiet. "But my nephew works in security. He's always looking for content for his social media channels. He must have seen Emma speaking Chinese and thought it would go viral." David felt the familiar rage building, but this time it was different. This wasn't about business deals or corporate incompetence. This was about a child's privacy being violated, her remarkable moment being turned into internet entertainment. "Mr. Chen," Li Zhao said quietly, "this changes everything. If people think this was staged, if they believe we were using a child as a marketing tool, our reputations will be destroyed," Chen Wei finished, "and Emma will be at the center of a media storm that could follow her for the rest of her life." Emma, who had been listening to the Chinese conversation with growing understanding, stood up suddenly. "Stop!" she said firmly, her voice cutting through the adult panic. "Everyone just stop!" The room fell silent. "You're all acting like this is some terrible disaster," Emma said, looking around the table with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that adults rarely possessed. "But maybe it's not." "Emma," David said gently, "people on the internet can be very cruel. They might say things about you that will hurt." "They might," Emma agreed. "But they might also hear something that changes how they think about people who are different from them." She walked to the window overlooking downtown Chicago, her small figure silhouetted against the sprawling city. My teacher told me once that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing, even when you are scared. Emma turned back to face the room. I'm scared that people will be mean to me and my father, but I'm more scared of what happens if we hide. Miguel, who had been quietly listening to Emma translate the conversation, stood up and moved to his daughter's side. Mia, he said softly, you do not have to carry this burden. You are just a little girl. Emma took her father's hand. Papa, yesterday you were going to lose your job because people couldn't see past your accent to your heart. Today, these important businessmen want to give you a promotion because someone finally helped them understand who you really are. Geez, she looked around the room, her gaze settling on each adult in turn. If my words can travel around the world, maybe they can help other children who feel different. Maybe they can help other parents who work hard but don't get respect. Maybe they can help other business people remember that making money isn't the same as making meaning. Li Jiao was staring at Emma with something approaching awe. This child, he said slowly, is either going to change the world or be destroyed by it. David's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from the mayor of Chicago, requesting an immediate meeting about the Chinese girl who's making international headlines. They had less than 2 hours to decide whether Emma Rodriguez would become a symbol of hope or a cautionary tale about the price of speaking truth to power. But what none of them knew was that halfway around the world, Professor Li Wei was making phone calls that would change everything. The mayor's office felt like a war room. Mayor Patricia Williams sat behind her massive desk, flanked by her press secretary, chief of staff, and what appeared to be half the city's legal department. Across from them, David, Emma, Miguel, and an increasingly pale Janet Morrison waited for what felt like a tribunal. 3 million views, the press secretary announced, scrolling through his tablet. CNN wants an interview. The Today Show is sending a crew, and we've got international media requesting statements about Chicago's child diplomat. Mayor Williams, a shrewd woman in her 60s who'd navigated Chicago politics for decades, studied Emma with the kind of calculating gaze usually reserved for budget negotiations. Miss Rodriguez, she said carefully, do you understand what's happening right now? Emma nodded solemnly. People are watching me because they've never seen a kid like me before. Some of them think it's nice, and some of them think it's wrong. And what do you think? The mayor asked. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and David could see her processing thoughts far too complex for someone her age. I think, Emma said slowly, that people are hungry for something real. They're tired of watching grown-ups fight about everything and never fix anything. They want to believe that understanding each other is possible. The mayor's press secretary leaned forward. Emma, there are people saying this was all fake, that your father and Mr. Chen paid you to memorize a speech to manipulate the Chinese investors. Miguel's face darkened with anger, but Emma put a calming hand on his arm. Do you want to see my homework? Emma asked simply. She pulled out her tablet and showed them months of video calls with Professor Li Wei, handwritten Chinese characters, cultural studies assignments that would challenge college students. This is a year's worth of work, the chief of staff said, examining the documents. She's been studying advanced Chinese business culture for 12 months. Because I wanted to help people, Emma said, not because anyone paid me or told me to. Mayor Williams leaned back in her chair. Emma, I'm going to be very honest with you. This story could go 2 ways. Either you become an inspiration, a symbol of what's possible when people work to understand each other. Or you become a target for people who don't want the world to change. Which one do you think I should be? Emma asked. The mayor smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. I think you should be yourself. But I also think you need protection. The kind of protection that adults should have given you before any of this started. David felt a stab of guilt. In his excitement about Emma's abilities, had he put her in danger? "Ma'am," Miguel said carefully, his English measured but clear, "my daughter, she is strong, but she is still little girl. I do not want her to be famous if famous means she cannot be child." "Mr. Rodriguez," the mayor said gently, "I think it might be too late for that choice." Her phone rang and she answered with a sharp, "Williams." The conversation was brief, but David watched her expression shift from concern to something approaching amazement. "That was the Chinese Consulate General," she said after hanging up. "They want to invite Emma to Beijing as an official cultural ambassador, full diplomatic protocol." The room went silent. "They're also proposing a sister cities initiative between Chicago and Shanghai, with Emma as the youth representative." The mayor paused. "Emma, do you understand what this means?" Emma's eyes were wide, but her voice was steady. "It means people are listening." "It means," David said quietly, "that your words are changing policy at the highest levels of international relations." But even as they talked about diplomatic opportunities and cultural exchanges, David's business instincts were screaming warnings. Emma had become more valuable than any commodity he'd ever traded in, and in his experience, when something became that valuable, people would do almost anything to control it. His phone buzzed with a text message that confirmed his worst fears. "We need to talk. The video changes everything. Some people want the girl silenced. A friend." Looking at Emma's trusting face, David realized that saving her father's job had been the easy part. Now, they had to figure out how to protect a 7-year-old girl who had accidentally become the most important voice in international relations. The real test was just beginning. 3 months later, David stood in the lobby of the newly renamed Chen Rodriguez Cultural Center, watching Emma conduct her first official diplomatic meeting via video conference with children from 5 different countries. She sat at a small table designed just for her, switching effortlessly between English, Chinese, and Spanish as she helped young people from around the world share their stories. The threatening message that had terrified him in the mayor's office had turned out to be from Li Jiao himself. Not a threat, but a warning about competitors who wanted to discredit the cultural exchange program before it could gain momentum. Together, they'd navigated the challenges, turning potential obstacles into opportunities for even deeper understanding. Miguel appeared beside David, wearing the crisp uniform of the building's new Director of International Facilities. His English had improved dramatically over the past months, but more importantly, his confidence had blossomed. Watching his daughter change the world had reminded him of his own worth. "She wants to add Portuguese to her language studies," Miguel said with a mixture of pride and amazement. "She says there are children in Brazil who need someone to help them communicate with other cultures too." David smiled. Emma's appetite for languages had only grown as her platform expanded. The scholarship program she'd inspired now supported over 300 children worldwide, all learning to build bridges between cultures. "Mr. Chen," Emma called out, finishing her video conference and bouncing over to them with her usual energy. "Guess what? The kids in Shanghai want to start a pen pal program with kids in Chicago, and the children in Mexico City have been teaching their parents Chinese phrases they learned from our videos." Emma's viral video had sparked something unprecedented, a grassroots movement of children teaching adults about cultural understanding. Universities were studying the phenomenon. World leaders were referencing her speech in international forums, and most importantly, families around the globe were having conversations about acceptance and respect. "There's something else," Emma said, her expression growing more serious. "Professor Li Wei called today. She's retiring from Beijing University." David felt a pang of concern. Professor Lee had been Emma's anchor throughout this journey, the academic credential that legitimized her remarkable abilities. But, Emma continued, her face brightening, she's moving to Chicago. She wants to start a new program here, the International Children's Language Institute. She says Emma needs to be around other children who understand what it means to love learning about other cultures. David felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was joy rather than anxiety. Everything was falling into place in ways he could never have planned. And the best part, Emma said, taking both men's hands in her small ones, is that my father gets to be the facility director for the new institute. Professor Lee says the building will need someone who understands that taking care of a place is about taking care of the people in it. Miguel's eyes filled with tears. 6 months ago, he'd been facing unemployment because of his accent. Now he was being entrusted with managing an international education facility that would serve children from around the world. As they stood together in the lobby, David thought about Patrick, the Irish janitor who had changed his life decades ago. Patrick had shown him that kindness didn't require recognition or reward. It just required seeing someone who needed help and choosing to act. Emma had done something even more remarkable. She had shown the world that understanding each other wasn't just possible, it was joyful. Her infectious enthusiasm for learning about other cultures had reminded millions of people that their differences were treasures to be shared, not barriers to be feared. "Mr. Chen," Emma said suddenly, "I have one more surprise." She led them to a newly installed plaque near the building's entrance. It read, "In memory of Patrick O'Sullivan, who taught us that kindness plants seeds that grow into bridges. The Chen Rodriguez Cultural Center, where differences become gifts." David's vision blurred with unexpected tears. Somehow Emma had learned about Patrick and found a way to honor the man whose simple acts of kindness had started a chain reaction that led to this moment. "How did you?" David began. "I asked around," Emma said simply. Old-timers in the building remembered him. They said he was always helping people, always making everyone feel welcome. I thought he should be part of our story too. As David traced Patrick's name with his finger, he realized that Emma hadn't just solved a business problem or saved her father's job. She had reminded an entire world that love was the most powerful force for change, whether it came from an Irish janitor helping a struggling immigrant, a Chinese billionaire fighting for justice, or a 7-year-old girl who learned languages because she wanted to help people understand each other. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lobby floor, and in that golden light, David could see the bridge that love had built, stretching not just between cultures and languages, but between past and future, between fear and hope, between the world as it was and the world as it could be. Emma Rodriguez had taught them all that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the smallest acts of love. And in a city known for its towering architecture, the most important bridge they'd ever built was made not of steel and stone, but of understanding, compassion, and the unshakable belief that every voice, no matter how small, has the power to change everything.